Welcome to the second day of the Open Book Festival. It is the second day, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. And good morning to you all. Welcome to our panel discussion, Connecting to Self. My name is Wamuwi Mbao, and I will be moderating this conversation among three very different and very interesting authors whose books all have to do with many interesting things, which we'll get into in a little bit. So joining me today on stage, we have David Viviers, a writer and actor of screen and stage, whose novel Mirage is a wonderful narrative about the effective power of literature across time and space. It's a really, really interesting novel and a great read. Next to him, we have Irene Ndiritu, who is also an author, and she's been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize before. Her novel, Lucky Girl, is again a really, really intrepid narrative that, you know, kind of takes the Bildungsroman form and does very, very interesting things with it. So also a great read. And last but most certainly not least, we have Dr. Nadia Kamies, a scholar of historical and heritage studies whose book Off Center and Out of Focus, Growing Up Colored in South Africa, is a powerfully meditative work of creative nonfiction about intimate forms of resistance to apartheid. It's a fascinating text full of essay and narrative and pictures, and again, it does really very interesting things around the question of memory and you know, sort of family heritage and things like that, especially in relation to the often vexing question of identity in South Africa. So before this panel, you know, before we kind of came together, we were kind of sitting around downstairs and wondering, okay, what are the kind of connecting threads between these three quite distinct novels? And I hope that that's going to become clear over the course of the panel. But before we get into it, I think that it might be helpful for each of our authors to say a little something about their books, since you might not be familiar with what they've written. Shall we start with you, Irene?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my book is called Lucky Girl, and it's really a coming-of-age novel. It's about growing up and figuring out who you are, what's your identity. The protagonist leaves home, she leaves Kenya, and she goes to the United States to study. As quite a young person, and there's a lot that she sees there that makes her ponder about the world, the way she sees the world, what stereotypes she carries with her, and she needs to just shed all that and understand that the world is not what we always think it is, right? If you dig deep, there's way more. Yeah, so it's a novel about identity, really. That's it.
Thank you. Perfect elevator pitch.
Hello everyone, I'm David Viviers. My novel is called Mirage. It's set in the Karoo landscape. I think it's a novel of ideas where you know, there's a lot about the stars in there, about the plants of the Karoo, and it's about a lot of things, maybe too many things, but I think at its heart it's about a boy who's trying to make sense of the loss of his mother. So I guess it's also a novel of identity, trying to fill the holes of the past, make sense of the traumas of the past. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My book is Off Center and Out of Focus, Growing Up Colored in South Africa. And yeah, it's very much about identity and memory and me trying to make sense of where I fit in. It probably became more urgent for me to do that once I had children who were teenagers, and I had to think about where they fit in. And of course, with the erasure of history, all I really had to go on was photographs, and so that's what I've mined for the stories.
Thank you. Yeah, that works well. So Irene, if I may start with you, I think when I was reading your book, what I found really interesting is that, you know, your protagonist, Soila, she goes on this, you know, it's really kind of a journey of figuring out how to find a place for herself in the world, you know, and that's amidst, you know, sort of the very overbearing expectations of family and everything that comes with that. Would you say a little bit about her as a character, how you kind of conceived her, how she came to you.
How she came to be. Look, Lucky Girl was a short story. I did the creative writing master's at UCT. Anybody wants to do that, go for it. It's really good. So it was a short story, and it was very basic. It was about a woman who leaves home, goes to America, and falls in love with a black American man, and her mother is not buying. Her mother is like, you're not marrying this dude. Because a very traditional Kenyan, I don't want to say traditional because that makes it sound like she's from the village, but she's just like a very rigid, old school kind of mother who's like a tiger mom.
She's very much a tiger mom.
Has an idea of what she wants her child to be. She's a widow. She only has one child. She's got a lot of money. And she has this idea of what she wants her child to be. And she doesn't understand, why are you trying to get off the track of what I want you to do? Why are you talking about you want to do photography? I want you to have a business degree. Why are you talking about a black American man with dreadlocks? I want you to marry a Kenyan
just
boy.
Picture Basquiat.
Right? Yeah, exactly. I want you to marry a Kenyan boy who's a doctor, or whose family, we know, that all that crap. So Suela has to go away, and she has to first of all figure out, can she defy her mother? Can she actually stand up to this woman who's extremely domineering and controlling? I think bordering on abuse at some point. Will she have the courage to defy this woman and live her own life that she's chosen for herself? And so what I wanted to look at two things. One was trauma. If you have a parent who is maybe a little bit abusive in the way that she speaks, not necessarily hit you, doesn't beat you, but just maybe microaggressions, the way she speaks, but you know what I mean, like a bit of abuse. If you have that kind of parent, I think, actually I see Megan, we had yesterday a session on motherhood or mother trauma, the trauma that our parents can just project on us. And I think what I was trying to do, I was trying to show that a character is 360 degrees. And even though when you read the novel, you think, geez, this mother is just horrible, with time, through the story, you start to see why she's horrible.
Yeah.
And you realize, actually, she's not horrible. She's actually just broken. She's had her own trauma, and then she's had a child, and she's projecting all her issues on this child. And so I've spoken to a lot of people that have trauma with their moms, and one of the things that I found that helped me was to say, you know what, actually, this isn't about me. It's really not about me. You have issues. So every time you throw me a microaggression, I need to before I get into like a fight with you, or I need to go to therapy, I need to stand back and say, you know what, actually, this is not about me. You have some issues. You deal with yourself and your issues. It's not about me. And I think if all of us could think like that when we're dealing with our parents, that they're human beings, and they're also sometimes broken, and they have their own trauma, maybe it would help us feel, in a way, maybe understand a bit more, So that was the point of the novel. Identity. Figure out who you are, and do you, and stand up to your parents. Even though it's really hard sometimes.
As difficult as that might be, I mean, especially in your protagonist's case. David, I think with your protagonist, with Michael, I think there's, in a slightly different sense, a feeling that he's sort of shaped by, his parents and their kind of fracture, and obviously the kind of unspoken kind of traumas, no spoilers, that happen around or surrounding, his parents, and this kind of alienation from them. Would you say a bit about that?
Yes, so Michael lives alone with his cat in Hatfield Street.
Shame.
not based on reality at all. And so I think the novel opens up with him going through a breakup, but we also learn that his mother passed away when he was 12. And I think, so in a way, the mother's also a central figure of the book, but in her absence, as opposed to her, sounds like a very, strong presence in your novel. And I think, this idea, I read the other day that time, the only thing that makes time is change. So if nothing ever changed, we wouldn't actually be able to perceive time. We know that the day is moving on because the sun is setting, the earth's like things changing indicate that time is happening. And if you go to like this, I won't get into quantum mechanics because I don't understand it, but if you go into like the subatomic particle level, time doesn't actually exist. So in a way, it's something that we construct. And I think that implies that time is loss and nostalgia and memory because, people that were with us yesterday aren't with us today. And I think that's a central theme, or sort of what the book is constructed around, is how do we then make sense of the loss of a parent, but not just a parent, like friends that drift away. We all have friends who we don't speak to. Well, I do, that I don't speak to anymore. Or, a relationship that didn't work out for whatever reason. And it's almost like that's unavoidable. Things only have a certain amount of time in which they make sense. Yeah. And if you look at it in deep time, nothing lasts forever. And that sort of helped me make sense of breakups and losses and things. Michael's dad is also a very absent figure in the sense that he's still alive, but he's dealing with traumas of the South African border war. And I think Michael has to replace these figures in his lives with other things and construct a narrative out of the history out of his histories in order to make sense of it. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Okay, people are nodding, so that's good.
Even if it doesn't make sense.
It made sense in my head, and then you hear yourself say it, you're like, what am I saying? But I think that's what a book does. It puts events into sort of like a structure where you're like, okay, here it's the beginning and stuff's unfolding according to a plan. Yes, and that's what I think we look for in our own lives. And we situate it in the present, but by looking back at the past, we like to imagine that things are unfolding according to a plan. And I think that's why we turn to religion and whatever that may be, whether it's quantum mechanics or, we need an overarching structure to our lives. Otherwise, it's all chaos. Yes. Right? Yeah. Okay. I don't know if that was even what the question was, but anyway.
It makes sense when you write it.
I know. I'll write it down afterwards.
Of course, Nadia, I must come to you now. And I think what really resonated with me reading your book is the way you kind of enact this kind of what I'd call a visual conversation. You take images and you go, like, here's a photo of me and my brothers, as young children. And then you read these photos in this incredibly, forensic and intimate way, which then makes them kind of expand into this three-dimensional world in a way which is really it's really something if you haven't read the book. Would you say a bit about how that process was for you? I mean, digging into that kind of archive of family memories and things.
Okay. In a way, I didn't have a choice but to mine those photographs because when I started looking, my mother didn't even know what her grandparents' names were. There were whispers of white grandfathers and things like that, or great-grandfathers, and things that you never spoke about. And she came from a time when you didn't ask. You just carried on. Whatever she did know, she overheard her mother tell someone else. And so, I went to the archives. I couldn't find much. And one side of the family is Christian, and the other side's Muslim. So there was even less to find out on my father's side because Muslim marriages weren't recognized, etc. And so I started with these photographs, and they were like they were off-center and out of focus. They were not great photos often, but they were taken at specific times. They were taken to mark occasions, special occasions. And they were like these containers of memory that, and once, they were also great conversation facilitators. So, I mean, my father especially, I mean, although he spoke a lot about growing up in District 6, and there were sort of the deeper layers that didn't come out. But once you started speaking about a photograph, it was like I didn't exist anymore because he was talking to the photograph. So I think in a way they were also, I mean, for me, I speak a lot about the resistance to being labeled colored, and that there were that it was a control that our parents had over how we were presented. That yes, you might, say things about our hair and the broadness of our noses, etc., the color of our skin, but this is who we are. This is how we choose to present ourselves. So it was very much, I think, a way of resisting the very negative narratives that went along with being labeled colored.
Yeah, and I mean that is a critical part of your narrative, the story of finding these points of resistance, which kind of come to the surface in the visual archive. These points where people resist the incursion of, government trying to fix them in a particular way, trying to say you are colored and so this means that you are this and you are that. And that's definitely a very strong thread that runs through your book.
I think it was also a way of taking some control. I mean, the apartheid government controlled every aspect of our lives, where we could live, who you could marry, who you could have sex with, where you could go to school, what you could become. But that space within our homes, I mean, our parents control that, and especially our mothers. And I mean, I always joke that I started on this journey because of my mother's lounge, that we were not allowed to go into. It was just like this perfect space for people to show. And I think
we have one of those.
And the way we were dressed and then captured, and photographs were not, they were not common. It was expensive to have a camera, it was expensive to print photographs, and so often it was a visiting uncle or somebody who was coming that day, or it was Eid or Christmas, and so we were captured at our best.
Yeah, I think many of our photo archives have that feeling of, those moments that you look back at and you're like, oh, I remember that outfit. That was distinctly uncomfortable. Irene, I think I want to kind of hop on the point of sort of the generational thing especially, because I think in your book, what very rapidly comes to the fore is, the friction that arises between Soila and her mother has a lot to do with sort of generational ideas of propriety, generational ideas of what is acceptable. And even though, for instance, Soila's mother is not necessarily she's conservative, but at the same time, she's someone who's quite a radical figure. She's made a way for herself in the world through many very cruel challenges in life. But she definitely kind of finds herself generationally opposed to everything her daughter and sort of the younger members of her family do. So would you say a bit about that kind of generational conflict, if you want to call it that? Maybe that's too harsh a word.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Even just looking at the way that I live my life, my children think they call me a boomer, even though I'm really not a boomer. Because in their minds, they just think you're so old, Like the way that you see the world, right? They just think like you're so old. I think the word that's used often is, oh, you're so embarrassing, right? Because so in the same way, Soila's mom is actually a boomer. Soila's mom is a boomer for real. She's a boomer, and she's also, she's also an African boomer. She's very different kind of boomer from an American boomer, right? So she's got all these weird, like, I don't know, you know, who you're going to marry and all that. And I think Soila then is a Gen X. She's my age. So the children born in the late 70s.
Yeah.
And she then goes and lives overseas. And she sees a totally different world. I think the first thing that she notices when she goes to the US is she goes to a party. Somebody's having a party, a musician is having a party in their apartment or whatever. And she sees two men kiss. And she almost falls over. Because in Kenya at the time, these are not things that happened. And, you know, there wasn't even any, like, living in the closet. You just did not even consider not living in the closet. You know, it's just, it was such a far-fetched idea. Homosexuality is just something that, you know, nobody talked about. The book is set in the 90s.
Yeah.
So she even is grappling with things that she hasn't seen before.
Yeah.
And she doesn't know how to deal with these things that she's seeing. You know, so when my kids read the book, my daughter goes, I don't understand this Soila. I don't understand why she's making the choices she's making. Why does she feel like she has to do everything her mother tells her to do?
Yeah.
Because in her mind, she can do whatever she wants to do because her mom will support her choices. So she's struggling with this girl. She doesn't understand why does she have to leave this guy? This is the guy that she loves just because her mother said.
Yeah.
Right? So
That was one of the slightly infuriating things. I definitely had a few moments where I was like, why? But as we wait for them, and they're on their way. Yeah, but I mean, it was really, she's a very well-rounded character in that regard because you feel her vulnerability in moments like that.
Yeah, so that's for me what generation is. I don't always understand the things that my parents are talking about. I just find them really narrow-minded, right? In Kenya, it's very tribal. So the issue there is tribal, right? So it's like, the things that they talk about, I'm like, why are you so tribal? What does it matter that Christine wants to marry a guy from another tribe? Who cares? But to them, it's an issue, complete issue. And so to the point where people in my generation didn't always marry the person that they wanted to marry, even in Kenya, because the parents were just not going to buy it. Like, what do you mean? We're Kikuyu, you want to marry a Luo guy? That's not gonna happen. And it's a done deal, and it's not happening. It's not happening, right? Or you're Christian and you want to marry a Muslim guy. It's not happening, right? And then fast forward to our generation, and we're way more open with our kids, and we allow conversations. We allow them to even imagine. Like, we couldn't even imagine. We were not even allowed to imagine. It's the way it is, you know? And then coming up to my kids' generation, where they think I'm weird, right? When I tell them to explain to me, what is the plus after LGBTQ? What is the plus and all the other ones that come after the plus? They're like, you're so embarrassing. Right? So that's generations, right?
It is. I mean, David, I think what I found really interesting about your book is that in some senses you have, you know, kind of, if genre is kind of like a box, let me start off with that way. I'll start with the clumsy metaphor. You know, the box is sort of the traditional South African novel, and, you know, with its kind of delving into history and things like that. And you play around with those forms in a way which I think is really very interesting, you know, because you blend, you know, it's a novel where your protagonist is queer, but that's not sort of the central focus of the story, although it plays a role in it. And it's a novel which has, a very strong historical dimension to it. And again, that's also, all of these things kind of merge together to tell a very interesting kind of story. Question, not question.
Thank you. I think that's maybe just because all the things I find interesting or exciting or that makes me want to read a book, I put into one book. So it sounded like that was a compliment, so I'll take it as that. Yeah, I read a review the other day that said they didn't understand why I'd made Michael queer, which I just thought was such a... I mean, it was a very nice review otherwise.
I was like, you read your reviews?
No, someone showed it to me. I read no, I'm joking. No, I came across it on Goodreads or something.
You read Goodreads?
This is going down.
It's really bad.
Someone showed me the review, okay? And I just thought it was a strange thing to query, because no one's ever said, like, why did they make the character straight, Anyway, that's besides the point. What was the question? Oh, defying... yeah, so you said there's a historical aspect to it as well. So I've always been fascinated by the life of Olive Schreiner, but in a weird way. Like, I sometimes imagine that I'm reincarnated Olive in the present day. I don't know why. I think it's the way...
Go with it.
Yes, there's talk going. I think, it's the way she writes about the landscape. And I remember once reading her book, because we were forced to read it, The Story of an African Farm, on the Jamie shuttle from Upper Campus to Hidden Campus. And I remember reading something about the way she had written about a cloud. And I looked out the window, and there was this white cloud above the ocean, and I was just like, oh man, something's happening here. And the way she writes about... when you read when you think a thought, and then you read it, someone else has written the exact same thought that you were thinking, and it's almost like, how is it possible that someone who lived 100 years before I am in the present moment has had the exact same way of thinking about the landscape and the world? So that was really exciting. So I wanted to bring all of that into the book, the Karoo landscape, because I love the Karoo. It makes me very sad when I'm there. I don't always know why. There's a sort of melancholy, but also a beauty. Again, I don't know how this relates to your original question, but I'm going with it. There's I say it's like a tingle you feel in your spine. And I think my favorite thing about the Karoo is if you go out at night and you look up at the stars, you're looking back into time, because the light takes, it's limited in the time it can reach us. And if you go down beneath your feet, you're also going back in time with the rocks. And we're talking about millions of years. So I think the Karoo is, whenever I'm there, I'm forced to think about things of like deep time and how did we come to be here. So that also, talking about genre defying, you see it's relating to the original question. That comes in. What other...
I mean, I suppose I had a really strong kind of resonant moment while reading your book, not just because of that, how you capture that sense of the uncanny, the connection between yourself and the present and, someone writing 100 years ago. But I mean, on a very personal, sort of deep level, many, many years ago, our honors class, Rhodes University, we took a field trip to the heart of the Karoo, and we climbed Buffalo's Hook. I say climbed, it was a very impromptu sort of hike. There was no path, don't do that. To go and see where, she was interred and this kind of thing. And so we had that moment, and you really brought that back, those sort of memories. You evoked that in such a wonderful way, 'cause your character, Elizabeth Tennant, is, there are these echoes, you can see the kind of Schreiner echo, but she's also this own thing.
Yes. Well, Olive Schreiner never wrote about portals in the Karoo and all that, so that stuff's made up. But I did the same pilgrimage to her grave a while back, and then my laptop was stolen, so all those photos have been wiped. So I'm very sad about that. I'll have to go back. But I remember standing like at the top there, and the Karoo, I mean, you must have had this too, it just stretches out forever and ever and ever. And there's something about the vastness there, where you can't help but think about, your whole life and where you come from and where you're going. It's like the Valley of Desolation in Graaff-Reinet. I'm sure people have been there, but it's the same thing. I think there's just something about space. I think
Yeah.
it's the space of the Karoo where, yeah, I don't know, it strips everything away. It's like a very, I think in the book I mentioned it's got the same sort of beauty as mathematics. It's like something that's at its simplest form and everything else is stripped away. So maybe that's part of the attraction of the landscape. I don't know.
No, I think so. And I mean, very happily you kind of lead on to my next sort of point, which is about space. Because I think that, you know, in your different ways, you each write about, or what you write about has a lot to do with space and then our sort of personal relation to it. And of course, Nadia, I think in your book, one of the central aspects of it is thinking about how identities are forged in the context of displacement and how they are so strongly tied to, you know, questions of space. You know, I don't want to over-egg the District 6 thing, but I think, you know, those sorts of connections that you make in the book to family links to particular neighborhoods in Cape Town and what happens when those links are disrupted or forcibly disrupted, when people are forcibly removed and aren't allowed to go back to those places or can only go back to them much later or never go back to them. You know, space forms a very critical part of your narrative. He says.
Okay, I was worried you were going to talk about space.
Maybe place.
We
rather than
can.
space.
Yeah, I mean, we're in District 6, so we can't not speak about it. And this space is very familiar to me, actually, because this was the old Saks Futron building, and it was a wholesalers. And I remember coming here with my parents. They sold everything. They sold crockery and clothes and fabric, and so I think my book's very much rooted in District 6 and rooted in my father's memories. And there's that generational trauma, but as well as blessing, I think, of where we come from. And although I didn't grow up in District 6, we lived in Warm Estate, which is the edge of District 6. But my grandmother lived in District 6, and Hanover Street was the connecting artery. You in those days, you had to go through Hanover Street into the city. I mean, that's where you went for everything. There was no malls in the suburbs, and so I feel very much that's where I come from. That's my space, and then of course the feeling of community. I was once accused of romanticizing District 6, but I was part of it. I come from it. I grew up on the stories of it, and in spite of the poverty and the crime that happened, there was a sense of community, and it was almost like a vision of how we could live, that we could live with all these different ethnicities and cultures and religions, and then it was so forcibly destroyed, and it was much more than just the space that was destroyed. It was the community. It was the Christmas bands and the Malay choir and the church and the mosque, or the communities who attended those spaces, and you know, the sports clubs, all of those things went along with the space. It was much more than just that. And what I remember most about my grandmother being moved out of Constitution Street to Mitchell's Plain was that loss of her independence. Of you know, when she lived here, she could walk into town, she could get on the bus, she could go to the post office to fetch a pension, and then she was in Mitchell's Plain. There was no infrastructure. I mean, these houses were all built, and then, you know, the schools came after, the libraries and whatever came after that. And for the first time, she had to ask someone to take her into town to get her pension. So I think all of those things are just tied up with space, and so much more than physical space. There's yeah.
I think, I mean, that really struck a chord with me when you mentioned, especially that you talk about your grandmother and that feeling of, you know, that loss of independence in the book. But I think perhaps because so much has been said about, you know, District 6 and, you know, the loss and what went on in that process, in some senses, it almost becomes quite difficult to write about it, I would imagine, from a historical point of view, without retracing old ground, you know. And I think one of the key moments, or one of the key things for me about your book is that because you have this wonderful blend of kind of the intimate, you're talking about, you know, sort of family relationships and what happens in the kind of after moment as well. You know, what happens to people once they are displaced? How do they keep ties together? How do they keep community within their home spaces when they're no longer in that physical space? You bring something new to that narrative. You know, it's not the kind of tried and tested kind of thing that we're familiar with.
What new thing?
Just a comment, more than anything. That wasn't really a question. I tend to gush because I sit with these books and reading through them, the points of connection that you find in each of the narratives is quite fascinating. But with your book particularly, I think how you evoke, you know, that the sense of how people's homes matter to them and the sense of home in all its multi-layered meanings is quite something. I mean, I'm going to bounce from that to you, Irene, again, just to say that because your protagonist kind of moves about in the one sense, you know, Kenya is kind of a space that she starts out in, and then she goes to, you know, New York, you know, in this very particular kind of New York. You know, it's sort of New York in the tech boom and bust era, New York just before the, you know, the World Trade Center attacks and all of that. And there again, I think there's a very key sense in which you evoke that kind of geographical journey, the movement, like how you or how your character as an African person finds herself, you know, navigating, moving to the global West, you know, moving into the first world, and how she has to then balance, you know, both sort of her own expectations and then also how people read her and respond to her in that space.
Is that a question?
Yes, it is. So my question is, you know, how did you go about plotting that? Like, what was the sense you were trying to kind of bring to the reader in terms of how Soila navigated, you know, being in America as someone who comes from, you know, an African country with all the readings that go with that, you know, being African, but also as someone with a very strong sense of her own identity.
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, she's an immigrant. And when you're an immigrant, I've been an immigrant twice in my life. I've been an immigrant to the United States for a long, long time, and then I've been an immigrant in South Africa. And it's a unique experience for anybody that's been an immigrant. You guys understand? It's like you're just taken and you just dropped like a pebble in this vast unknown. And you know, you've come with your stereotypes. You've come with, you know, the things that you thought you knew, which are probably not true, right? Maybe before you came to South Africa as a black person, based on just what you've seen in the news or whatever, you're thinking, oh my God, these white South Africans must be scary, you know? Or maybe when Soila goes to the United States, she realizes, even though she's black, she's not really black.
It has different resonance,
right?
Yeah, different meaning.
She starts to realize she's like a different brand of blackness. And I think in the very beginning, she's really shocked when she realizes, I have nothing in common. We have the same skin, we have the same hair, but we just have absolutely nothing else in common. And she also really grapples with racism because she doesn't understand racism because she's coming from a country where it's homogenous. Everybody, I mean, there's a lot of Indians, but for the most part, you don't really see the whites. They kind of live in their own parts of the country. And so she just really struggles because she's never really dealt with racism. And now here she is, and she's sitting in a restaurant with her friends, some of whom are black, and the waiter kind of takes his time, you know? And so the other girls are going, look at this, it's just because we're black. You know, we're being ignored because we're black. And she's sitting there going, really? Because I think he's just busy. It's a busy day, you know, he's overwhelmed. And the girls are like, you just don't get it. You don't get it because you don't understand racism and you don't come from a legacy of slavery. And so what would you know about microaggressions and all of that? But then with time, she starts to see, oh my God, this shit is not imagined. He really was not busy. He really wasn't busy. He was just being ignored because maybe there's this idea of like black people don't tip well or don't tip, you know? And so that, you know, in restaurants, they're not, you know, the waiter is not going to be rushing for your table. You know, so she has to learn all these things that are so foreign to her. And all the things that she thought she knew, you know, back then in the 90s, there wasn't social media, right? When I talk to my little nieces or whatever in Kenya, they say, I don't want to go to America. Because they've seen on social media the things that go on there with being black. But now they have this idea, like the minute they land into the country, you know, they'll be chased by the police. And then, so they have all these crazy ideas. Soila didn't have any of that because there was no social media in the 90s. Her whole concept of America was glittery. It was what you see on Dallas and Dynasty and Cosby Show. You know, maybe she did watch Boys in the Hood, but maybe she thought that's just, you know, that's just one part.
Just
of
avoid
the country,
the hood
right?
and you'll be fine.
Right? America is amazing. America is your, you know, everything that you want. It's da-da-da. And then she gets there and she's like, oh my God, this place is crazy. She's struggling with the white Americans. She's struggling with the black Americans. And so, like I said before, it's about, when you're an immigrant, it's about you, everything that you know, who you think you are, everything has to come apart.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but if you hold on to who you are and what you think you know, and da-da-da, you'll struggle in a foreign country, you know? So it's like she has to like just shed all these stereotypes, who she thinks she is, whatever, and just sort of just grow all over again at age 20.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think what's really interesting about that is that, you know, obviously this is happening sort of in a time frame before like our current day discourses around privilege and, you know, those sorts of things. And so what's really interesting about Soila is that because she comes from a position of relative privilege in her own society, sometimes she's, you know, literally colorblind to certain realities. And those sort of moments of friction that she has with her African-American friends are some of the most fascinating points in the novel, where people kind of check her on her assumptions about the world, or assumptions about people being lazy or not willing to work.
I mean, if Soila was a white person, she'd be a racist.
Yeah.
Right? She would be a racist.
Sorry.
She would be. I mean, she's very economically privileged. She doesn't understand. She has all these stereotypes. She's like, why are these black people, why do they not work? Why do they not want to work? Why are they getting incarcerated? All of them are in prison. You know, she has all this crazy, right, quite arrogant. From my experience, when I first went to the States, the Africans were the most problematic people that I met, because they have all these ideas, because coming from Africa, we just don't really understand. Now there's social media, so you understand more. But at the time, really, there just was no understanding of what blackness is.
Yeah.
We even didn't realize we were black. Let's just stop there, because we're all black in the country. When you go there and you're told, you're black, and you're like, so? What's the big deal, right? You're a minority. Huh? None of it is making sense, right? So you first have to really just shed all your arrogance and realize that in the United States, actually you're a second-class citizen. And actually, you are just like a black American. You may not think you are, but actually, as far as the white American sees, you are a black American because you're black, and all the black people are just black, and you're all second-class citizens, by the way. And so when Soila has to just understand that and drop the arrogance, she has to get a new identity.
Which she does over time, spoiler alert.
With time, yes. Very slowly.
Okay,
Yeah.
shall we take some questions from the audience? There is a roving microphone. Don't all rush to answer. Yes. Wait for the microphone.
Hi. Sorry, so my question's directed to Nadia. I think everyone's had one or two experiences of speaking to someone, their parent, their grandparent, about lives they had before, photos that can conjure up so much images. Did you find that was were the family members you were speaking to always very open to sharing that? Was it a difficult process to get them to talk about it? Did you find differences, and I guess how did you work with that?
Yes, I think there's definitely differences. I think in many ways the photograph made it easier, and when I was doing my research for my thesis, I interviewed people and I asked them to bring a photo so that it could help the conversation. But it's painful to remember as well. And in retrospect, I realized that my father shared a lot of the happy memories about District 6 with us. But in order to really dig deeper, it was painful. And I for a long time wanted to take him to the District 6 Museum because I thought it would make it easier. And he was so resistant to that. He said, why do I need to go there? I've lived through there. I don't need to see that again. And I can't remember exactly how he did agree to go. But once he was there, it was such a positive experience. And I think it was very much because of the memorabilia and the personal things that are in the museum. And it was like he was being welcomed into a space that he was familiar with. That's how I start the book. Actually, is about just trying to write down what he was saying as he remembered. I mean, he didn't speak a lot normally, but there he just became so animated. And he recognized photographs, and he recognized people and places, the school that he'd been to, his Standard 5 teacher, up on the wall, the rugby club that he played for, there's a banner with, and so I think definitely those objects help with memory. And yes, there is resistance, but I think it's definitely a way of overcoming that. And yeah, I mean, afterwards he sat down and it just these stories just dropped out. And so I recommend using the photographs.
There's a hand.
Hi, my question is also for you. When you were talking just now, I was thinking about the ways in which we use things or objects or or specific events as like catalysts for memory and like having those difficult conversations, you know. And oftentimes it comes, well, for me at least, when I look back, it's come when I was least expecting it, you know. I went home one day and I convinced my dad to sit and watch Shaka Ilembe with me, and he was disappointed at the fact that it was in Zulu and he had to read subtitles. But this fighting scene came on where they were fighting with their spears and their thingies, and he told me when he was a child he had a memory of that happening in his little village where people came and they stood on either side, and that's what they did, and they fought. And ever since then, I've been craving that, you know, like searching for ways to unearth those memories. And photographs is a beautiful way. Are there any other ways that you did that? You know, use things to prompt these conversations.
Yeah, definitely ordinary objects and the objects that our parents and our grandparents felt important to hold on to, or things that they made, that they touched. They carry. They give us a sense of belonging, and I do write about my grandmother's doilies that she crocheted, and the scarf that she wore when she came from Mecca that was handed down to me and that I wore as a headdress when I got married, and when my son had his name given, we wrapped him in that scarf. And even though he never actually met his great-grandmother, there was this link through this ordinary object. But the object was also so much more than just that, because it's called a medora, and it's embroidered with gold or silver thread, and it has its origins in Indonesia, so there's that link to slavery there. And the fact that my grandmother went on pilgrimage, she went by sea in those days, you know, it was like an 8-month journey via sea, and so there are all these sort of layers of that connected us all the way back to slavery, really, because that's how the tradition came here, that's how the religion came here, you know, and then her going on the sea again to Mecca, buying this scarf, bringing it back here. There's this whole sort of multi-layered history that's, you know, looks like the simple scarf, but it holds so much more. And I've written about the doilies that she crocheted as well, and other things, yeah.
1, 2, 3. Him.
Hello. Oh, okay. Just talking about authenticity of self and the identity of self. I think as writers we're sort of asked or instructed almost to write what you know, especially when you're starting out, because your own experience is informing your voice and who you are as an artist, if I can say that. So, I mean, anyone can answer this question, but it would be very, very boring to have a story that's just completely homogenous, that's just all you know, kind of thing. So when writing characters that aren't like your ethnicity or your religion or outside of what you know, how do you do that, and how do you keep that authentic to make sure that you're not, I don't know, enforcing stereotypes or you know, misrepresenting anything?
Well, like outside of your time frame, like with Elizabeth Tennant in your book.
Well, I mean, I think, I can obviously only speak for myself, but I think any character that you write, it has to contain some part of yourself, or or some of your understanding of the world. But I think, you know, the problem is we often aren't aware that we're perpetuating stereotypes while we're doing it. So I think, for example, I have a character, Oom who lives in the Karoo, and obviously his experience of it is very different to mine. So I had a friend, Amy Leakas, and I sent her certain parts just to check that, you know, she felt that he was being represented in a way that was still honorable. But I mean, there's still, I don't know if, yeah, I think you can't help but put your own life and experiences into characters, and I think that's okay. Also with Elizabeth, you know, there was a lot of research into Olive Tennant, but again, Olive Schreiner. But I mean, again, it's also my perception of her and my imaginings of how she lived and thought, and maybe she's like totally different to how I imagine her. But I think, yeah, I think it's, you know, writing is such a lonely thing in a way. I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but it's fine to sort of speak to other people and get their input, and I think that has helped. I wouldn't have been able to do it totally alone, you know. Yeah, I don't know what you guys think about the answer.
I agree.
They agree.
I agree.
There was another hand over there. Yeah.
So, in fact, Ms. Nadia, as you were busy trying to connect to the past, when you realized the barriers that your parents had sort of stumbled upon, whether being removed or certain parts of their memory being taken away, as you were engaging them, did you find that your writing was sort of redeeming to them? Did you find that curiosity coming back, them sort of expressing some of those dark spaces? Because if you look at what was being done, I think it was orchestrated so that they lose a part of themselves. Here you are now coming back, shining the light. Did your writing also help your parents to sort of go back and connect to self that that was taken away from them?
Okay, I'm old enough to also have had those things done to me, so I had the same experiences. So for me personally, it was very much a way of processing and trying to come to terms with that. Yeah, my father died during COVID, and I think it was really the catalyst for getting the book done. It was, we couldn't mourn him properly, we couldn't bury him, we couldn't do the prayers and all the rituals, and so he didn't get to see the book, but I think definitely for him it would have been very affirming. It was a validation of his life, and I think for my mother also, although I'm not quite sure how she feels about me writing about her lounge, but I think it's definitely, and it's the same sort of experience of going to the District 6 Museum for my father, of this validation of that what we went through is worth writing about, it's worth talking about, it's an acknowledgement, it's saying this happened to you, and we bear witness to that, and it's a way of healing, of moving forward from that. And another motivation for starting on this journey was very much about trying to open up this conversation, that we haven't spoken about the seemingly small hurts, the small insults. Yes, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and we spoke about gross human violations, but the everyday humiliations that we went through, we haven't spoken about. And until we actually do that, until we say, this is what happened, or from my book, I feel like I'm saying this is what happened to me, and that I hope that it can open up a platform for other people to say, yeah, and this is what happened to me too. And it's not about anger and revenge, it's about acknowledgement of pain, and saying, okay, now we can move forward.
Cool. We have promptly come to the end. Do we have time for one question? It's very quick. What do we think?
Very quick. I'll be very quick. Thank you. All your books sound wonderful, and the discovery of self through space and time. I think that seems to be the common theme, if there is. But what particularly interests me, that Wamuwi actually alluded to, the narrative style that you use, David. And you spoke about his breakaway from the traditional, I think you used the term box of a novel. Could you elaborate slightly on that, not including the space and time, which I got, but the actual narrative structure or the form?
The form of the book itself.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you mean in terms of like how I use time? No, not time. We're staying away from time. Okay. Okay. So I think, formally, the form. Did I? Okay. No, you were right. Yeah. Okay. Now I'll tell you. So it's written. I see it as sort of layers. Yeah. So the one layer is journal entry. So each chapter begins with the journal entry that was written 100 years ago in Elizabeth Tennant's voice. Then it's followed by something that happens in the present. And throughout there's sort of links that you know, what is being written about in the journal entry is sort of echoed in the present day. So I don't know if that's part of the structure of
Very
it
much
that you're talking. Yeah. So I mean, the whole time it's sort of layering time on top of each other with this very sort of 19th century voice contrasted with the modern, sort of a much more modern contemporary setting. So I don't know if that's sort of breaking the box of
it's that connection
setting.
that then happens between them as a result of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think they are very different styles. I mean, the diary is written in a very particular style, and the modern day is also totally different. So it's almost like
It's like two novels in one.
Yes.
Yeah. It's really good.
That's nice.
I should be your publicist. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming to this lovely session. It only remains to give thanks to our authors.